Well, we're smack in the middle of summer, and that means, of course, a busy season of work, play, and, well, naturally more play, which also means that vacation schedules being what they are, well, this time around we didn't have time to book a new guest. Fortunately, we have a couple of old guests who'll be with us to refresh our memories about one of the world's greatest Sherlock Holmes and Arthur Conan Doyle scholars and collectors, Richard Lancelyn Green. But before we get to that, we'd like to ask you one simple favor. Won't you nominate I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere or Trifles for a podcast award? Just go on over to podcastawards.com, log in, and nominate us in the arts category. It just takes a minute or two of your time, and we would be eternally grateful. Now, on with the show.
Support for this episode of I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere is made possible by the Wessex Press, the premier publisher of books about Sherlock Holmes and his world. Find them online at wessexpress.com. And the Baker Street Journal, the leading publication of Sherlockian scholarship since 1946. Subscriptions available at bakerstreetjournal.com.
I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, episode 124, a replay to keep the memory green.
I hear of Sherlock everywhere since you became a chronicler.
In a world where it's always 1895, comes I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, a podcast for devotees of Mr. Sherlock Holmes, the world's first unofficial consulting detective.
I've heard of you before. You're Holmes the meddler, Holmes the busybody, Holmes the Scotland Yard Jack in office.
The game's afoot as we discuss goings-on in the world of Sherlock Holmes enthusiasts, the Baker Street Irregulars, and popular culture related to the great detective.
As we go to press, sensational developments have been reported.
So join your hosts, Scott Monty and Burt Wolder, as they talk about what's new in the world of Sherlock Holmes.
You couldn't have come at a better time!
One warning for those of you with sensitive ears. This was originally the 8th episode of I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, over 10 years ago. And the audio is not quite up to snuff with what you're used to. We've improved our equipment over time. We've improved our editing process. However, technology has not improved significantly enough for us to fix the audio that you're about to hear. We hope, however, that the content itself will distract you from some of the annoying audio, at least to our ears. This week, Burt and I are happy to have two guests with us here on the line. We have Steve Rothman, who is the current editor of the Baker Street Journal, and Nick Utekin, who actually just finished a 30-year run as editor of the Sherlock Holmes Journal. And Steve and Nick actually have been working on a major project for quite some time, and I think it's the first of its kind as a collaboration between the Sherlock Holmes Society of London and the Baker Street Irregulars. And it is a book which I will let them tell us about. Gentlemen, welcome.
Thank you.
Welcome indeed.
Thank you.
So before we get into the formalities of the book, I mentioned that both of you have had the editorial post at your respective publications. Why don't we talk about that a little bit, about your experiences as editors and what brought you there and what keeps you there in some thoughts, or Nick, in your case, what kept you there for so long?
I think what kept me here for so long was that no one else was rising up to take my place. I was made editor of the Sherlock Holmes Journal at an inordinately early age of 24 in 1976,
wow.
Which was very kind of the hierarchy of the Sherlock Holmes Society. And so one proceeded, and one wrote 1 million reviews, and one wrote 1 million editorial notes and editorials. And then it finally became apparent to me that perhaps, the readers and the members of the society deserved something else other than my voice trumpeting at them twice a year. and that's why I stood down. And we'd always look for someone who was going to be slightly younger than me, actually, to take over. Someone that's like I was, age 24, to take over. In fact, Roger Johnson, our esteemed present editor, is 4 years older than me.
It's kind of like Roger Moore taking over from Sean Connery.
Well, that's exactly right. I'd also been lucky enough that Julian Wolfe gave me the investiture of the ancient British barrow in 1975. So all sorts of things were happening for me before I was 25 years old.
Evidently. Now, I would imagine over 30 years you've seen your fair share of crunches, of either having a dearth of material to choose from, or just kind of toiling through piles and piles of paper, I would imagine. What would you say were some of your biggest challenges that you came across?
I think there were several challenges. First of all, and Steve would agree that he has a much harder job than I do, because the Baker Street Journal comes out 4 times a year, the Sherlock Holmes Journal comes out twice a year. But leaving that aside, we're both as important as each other, I believe, obviously, in the Sherlockian world, the Holmesian world. And you take exactly the same approach, or at least I hope Steve does, that you want something that is new, something that is of a length that is suitable, and something that arrests the attention. And that's what you're on the lookout always for. And I have to say that over the years, I didn't always find that. People, I don't know whether it's the same with the contributors to the Baker Street Journal, but there are a lot of people who do, and a lot of people who sit back and want to receive and read, which is absolutely fine. I mean, you live your world in the Sherlock Holmes world as you wish to do it. But there were certainly times when the cupboard was very nearly bare, and every now and then one had to bring one's own writing ability, or friends like Catherine Cook or Roger Johnson or whomever, to add a little bit of spice when you knew that there was going to be some leeway to make up.
The usual suspects, as it were.
The usual suspects, and then, of course, as soon as you'd commissioned a usual suspect to do something, someone, perhaps whom one had never even heard of, would come in with a wonderful piece, absolutely identifying, oh, for heaven's sake, something in the Bruce Partington plans or Black Peter, and you really then you shift the usual suspect aside and put that piece into print as soon as you can, which is wonderful.
Oh, that's great. And for those of you who have not seen it, Nick actually wrote an interesting piece along these very lines for the summer issue of the 2007 Baker Street Journal. It's called Before Christmas, Editing the Sherlock Holmes Journal for 30 Years. And I just reread it over the weekend, and it absolutely encapsulates the very points that Nick was just making. So if what he said has intrigued you, and if you want to learn a little bit more about what goes on behind the scenes, by all means, take a look at that volume 57, number 2 issue of the BSJ.
Stephen, have you had a similar experience or how would you contrast the experience of editing the Baker Street Journal in the States to the one that Nick describes? I find it difficult to imagine that you've ever suffered from a real dearth of material.
I haven't, because occasionally a dearth of wonderful material, yes, but there's always been things there, and some of them you say, well, okay, I will finally publish this because there's really nothing else. I always describe putting together the journal as a jigsaw puzzle, because you have 1 or 2 pieces that you know you want to get in, and then you have other things that have to go in. And then you have to fill up the other pages, and possibly there's an ad coming in. You need to have some flexibility, and you have to find the pages of articles. The length of the articles often matters very much. So if you have a number of good articles, but they're all 20 pages long, well, that doesn't do in a 64-page journal. You can only publish 1 of them at most in an issue. And nor do you want to have a whole series of 4-page articles, because that becomes too choppy. So this is part of my theory. But by and large, when I read Nick's piece, which, by the way, was a commissioned piece, as he will happily confirm.
I will confirm that.
I knew that I was reading something that was very familiar to me, even though I hadn't had to live through it for 30 years, and I've I'm only halfway through my 8th year of editing the journal, which seems a long time indeed, and does mean I've done 37, almost 38 issues. So that I'm well on my way to catching up with Nick, and a few more years I'll have done it, and then possibly I'll put my job aside and feel I've done enough.
There you go.
No promise, though. But the thing is that what surprises me is that how often good things do come along saying something new. And that's what makes the job still fun. And I think Nick would agree that that's what continued to make the job fun for him.
I think a very long time ago, I took as a point below which I never would publish, and this is well beyond, before Steve's editorship of the Baker Street Journal, but many years ago, there was an article in the BSJ entitled "Mycroft Was a Computer."
That was for either of us. We're editors.
That was, okay, I'll take that point, but I read it, and I thought, okay, I will, were I ever to be an editor of the journal, never publish something like that, because this goes just beyond the game. It just didn't work. I apologize to the writer of that article if he or she is still alive. And you take a line, and at some point you say, yeah, that's good. Or you try and work occasionally, and I'm sure Steve does that as well. You know, a manuscript will come in or a piece will come in, and you'll say, yeah, you're nearly there. Can you give me a little bit more about that, just a touch more? And in my case, I know the Baker Street Journal doesn't use illustrations so much, but have you got a picture that can actually work with this new revelation that you're giving to the world? You know, over the years, that's often worked, and we got a better piece out of things than one might have expected at the beginning.
You know, that's a really interesting perspective, because I think in my own limited experience, having written for the Baker Street Journal, I've realized that the editor's job is not only to identify pieces that'll work, and as Steve has mentioned, try and fit the puzzle together, but it's also to act as a conduit of this raw material and coach the writers into a certain position and craft that so it fits with the rest of the journal.
Well, not even necessarily, if I may say, a certain position or to fit. You want to make that person's work appear in as good a light as it possibly can. And if you, as editor, can help with your alleged experience and years in the job, then so much the better. And that person might, you know, start writing regularly and start writing for other things as well. Yeah. I don't think I ever said anyone should ever write something to conform with a position that the journal should hold, other than I didn't like articles that were shorter than a double-page spread, that sort of thing.
Okay.
That's right. No, I think the important thing has been I've gotten some wonderful articles at times where I've read them through and I thought, well, here I am on page 5, and what are they trying to say? And then it comes, they hit you with their point. And you say, well, why is it here on page 5? Why have I had to read through 1,500, 2,000 words that really had very little to say? And I write to them and I say, you know, this would be much better if you moved this portion up here and moved that into your wastebasket. And, they do, and then it does read much better. But, of course, it's a much shorter article, and many people feel that to be published in the journal, they have to write these wonderfully ponderous things, or they need lots of footnotes because they like footnotes. And, well, yeah. Footnotes.
Enough said. Enough said. So let's talk a little bit about Richard Lancelyn Green. For those of you who are not familiar with Richard, as a person or even as the name, I think for anyone who's been in the Sherlockian or Holmesian world for any significant amount of time, the name Richard Lancelyn Green rings as probably one of the foremost experts in the world with regard to, particularly to Conan Doyle and Sherlock Holmes. He was a member of the Sherlock Holmes Society of London for many, many years. And was internationally renowned. Co-wrote the definitive bibliography of Conan Doyle with John Gibson. Unfortunately, in I believe the fall of 2004,
it was Mark.
Richard passed away. I'd like to say prematurely because he was somewhat of a young man. And I know across the globe, his friends, his colleagues, his associates, both within and without the Sherlockian world, really mourned his passing. With that, a project has come to bear because Richard left probably the largest collection of Conan Doyle and Sherlock Holmes related material to the Portsmouth City Library in England. And it is going on 4 years now, and I know it's still being cataloged. And as that's been happening, Nick and Steve have each kind of been working together on a project that we're going to talk a little bit more about, a book in Richard's memory.
Now, one of the great advantages, of course, that Nick has from the standpoint of the Sherlock Holmes Journal and the Sherlock Holmes Society of London is that being in the UK, being in London, you have the opportunity to do research on site, to talk to local manufacturers, to delve into local county records that are obviously much more accessible to the average Sherlockian scholar than to someone writing for the stateside publication. And as a result, there's been, I think, certainly much more appreciation of the life of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. And in fact, you two have just published a book that harkens back to certainly one of the last year's most prominent Doylean scholars, Richard Lancelyn Green.
Well, I think I'll let, speaking first, I'll let Steve answer the question first about how the genesis of this book came about.
When Richard died, there was emails started spreading across the Sherlockian world rather quickly, and I had gotten something, and Nick and I had been in touch possibly once or twice about the joys of editing a Sherlockian journal and giving each other's telephonic shoulders to cry upon. But we'd never met at that point, and but we talked very soon after Richard's death, and it seemed to me that the best memorial for Richard was a book, because Richard was a consummate bookman. He not only was he a collector of Conan Doyle, but he was very knowledgeable about books in general, particularly late 19th century, early 20th century English literature. And every book dealer knew him. When you would go through a book fair with Richard, it was, "Hello, Mr. Lancelyn Green. How are you, Mr. Green? I have something to show you, Mr. Green." And it was a wonderful sight to see. And he would just say, "Well, this is rubbish." Afterwards, "What did you buy, Richard?" "Oh, just a load of tat." But so I wanted to do a book, and Nick immediately agreed. I mean, he felt this was the best thing to do. And with Nick, the idea is to go into action, which is good, because otherwise nothing would have ever gotten done.
Well,
and,
not quite, because I'll interpose at this stage. As soon as Steve says we must do a book, and the basic book must be reminiscences and covering Richard in from as wide a perspective as possible. Of course Doyle, of course Sherlock, but let's get the other interests in if at all possible. And I think 2 days after Steve and I had spoken on the telephone about this, or by email, I just sort of sat down and tapped out a draft introduction, much of which remains in the introduction of the book as published, and things then sort of launched themselves as a result, and there became a tidal wave on both sides of the Atlantic. We got our masters on both sides of the Atlantic, as it were, i.e. the money men, to agree quickly, which was excellent.
So from just as a thumbnail sketch for those of our listeners who haven't heard of the book yet, is this a kind of the definitive biography of Richard Lancelyn Green, or is it more Richard Lancelyn Green the bookman, or?
It is aspects of Richard Lancelyn Green, I think, would be the best way to put it. When you say, Nick?
Oh, I agree entirely. I mean, we've called the book, as everyone knows, To Keep the Memory Green, Some Recollections of. And recollections is what it is. It is certainly not a biography. There are biographical elements in it, especially, for example, by all three closest members of his family, his mother, his sister, and his brother, June Lancelyn Green, has written the introduction. And then Shirard and Scylla have written long, interesting pieces, which are, of course, biographical of the younger years. And then many other people take up other elements of Richard's life.
Now, I know each one of you has had a rich experience with Richard, either as a fellow member of the society or visiting in one country or another with him. I wonder if you could each share with us, maybe your signature recollection of Richard that really encapsulates his relationship with you.
Sure. I first met Richard at a Baker Street Irregulars meeting at the late 1970s. And I said to him, well, that if you're ever in Philadelphia, because he said he would be traveling around, please stop by, because I do collect Conan Doyle, although in a much smaller way. This was before the bibliography that he and
John Michael Gibson
published together of Arthur Conan Doyle. And so when I didn't hear anything from him, and he didn't come by, and then about 2-3 weeks later, we had a phone call at about 7 at night saying, hello, I'm at the bus station. Come by, we said, have dinner. And so he was by in about 20 minutes and joined us for dinner. And I said, stay. No, I must be going on. No, stay. And no, I must be going on. I said, fine. Well, I had to be up for work the next day, and this was already by 1 in the morning or something like this. I said, Richard, here, let yourself out when you go. And then months later, when I heard from him with a letter or something, he said that he had left at 3 or 4 in the morning to go to the bus terminal to take a bus. That's how it was. But then the next time he did stay, deciding that we were acceptable people and we didn't murder him in his sleep, and he didn't murder us in our sleep, and all the books were there.
That's the important part, right?
And he did find many books that he was happy with, which was amusing. The thing about Richard is he would come, dressed in his blue jeans, a dress shirt, a pullover of some sort, and carrying often some rare first edition in a plastic carrier bag. He was always carrying things in his plastic carrier bag, and when he left, we gave him some plastic carrier bag from some local store that quite appealed to him, and he said he proudly carried it for months till it fell apart.
From my point of view, if I may, I knew Richard as a co-member of the Sherlock Holmes Society from effectively when we both joined in the mid-70s. I joined in 1966. He joined in about 1967, and one was vaguely aware of the names in the journal. And then as I rose up the tree, as it were, Richard became what I called in the immediate aftermath of his death, when asked by members of the press, a professional friend. I never knew Richard very well, but I saw him at a lot of meetings, and we obviously corresponded an awful lot and were in touch an awful lot. And it was only bizarrely in the early 1990s that I realized that he and I had been at the same college at Oxford University. He was 2 years younger than me, which is quite a chasm, actually, bizarrely. And I had never known that, and it had never come up in conversation, which is extraordinary, until I went to a gathering of alumni of University College, Oxford. By the way, a college suggested where Sherlock Holmes attended, but we'll leave that aside. And in about 1991 or 1992, and there was Richard standing at the bar holding a pint of beer, and we realized then that we had been in the same college, never known it, and only known each other through Holmesian links.
Well, that's amazing.
Well, it's typical of Oxford, shrouded, pathetic, old-fashioned student. No, sorry.
You're enjoying a conversation about the fruits of the labor of Nick Utekin, former editor of the Sherlock Holmes Journal, and of Steve Rothman, current editor of the Baker Street Journal. Their volume, Under the Quartering Press, is a subset imprint of the BSI Press. And it's the BSI Press that is offering a sale on certain volumes only through the month of July 2017. If you act now, you can be the lucky owner of To Keep the Memory Green for only half price. The essays in this beautifully produced volume were drawn from Richard's family and his many friends, both in and beyond the Sherlockian world, in Great Britain and the United States. And they reflect the man that they knew and admired. As you listen to Steve and Nick talk about the project and Richard, you have a sense as to what you'll get from these essays by and about Richard. Now available on BakerStreetJournal.com for just $15. This volume, as well as The Remarkable Characters of Arthur Conan Doyle, The Grand Game, Volume 2, and A Remarkable Mixture, are all on half-price clearance only until the end of July or until supplies run out. So get on over to BakerStreetJournal.com and let them know that I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere sent you when you check out. We're talking about the first effort between the Baker Street Irregulars and the Sherlock Holmes Society of London. And inasmuch as Nick actually wrote the 2006 Baker Street Journal Christmas Annual, which was called Quartering in the 50s, and I know had a very clever illustration on the front that basically brought to life what Sherlock Holmes said, I believe in The Adventure of the, was it Noble Bachelor? Mm-hmm. How he hoped one day to see the Union Jack and the Stars and Stripes quartered together on the same flag. Steve, could you tell us a little bit about how that inspiration kind of led the Irregulars, particularly under Mike Whalen, to think about where we're going today?
Well, we had always wanted to do this book as a joint work between the Baker Street Irregulars and the Sherlock Holmes Society, and as Nick said, both our masters were very pleased to do so. And then as the book became more apparent that it was going to be a reality, sometime late last year, Mike suggested that we publish it under, instead of just a joint imprint of the Baker Street Irregulars and the Sherlock Holmes Society of London, which is a mouthful, it's coming out under the imprint of the Quartering Press. And its logo as such is going to be the same logo, that the same illustration that's on the cover of Nick's Christmas Annual, which is Dr. Julian Wolfe's idea of what the quartered flag would look like, which shows the Union Jack in the upper left and lower right corners and the Stars and Stripes in the other two corners. And it's going to be very nice indeed.
So the idea with having such an imprint, the Quartering Press, is that it will extend beyond this single publication about Richard Lancelyn Green?
We certainly hope so. We certainly hope so, and indeed, although we cannot reveal it at the moment, and indeed the world will not be ready for some time yet, but we have at least one plan up our sleeves.
Excellent. Well, I know we'll be looking forward to it. Well, let's talk a little bit now about the ins and outs, maybe the difficulties and the challenges and the rewards, quite frankly, of quartering the Stars and Bars with the Union Jack in this case, where this first ever publication of the Baker Street Irregulars and the Sherlock Holmes Society of London has come to print.
Well, I think if I may start, Steve mentioned earlier the fact that we had spoken once or twice prior to Richard's death. I mean, obviously nothing to do with Richard's death, about editors, etc. But we met each other later in the year in 2004 when Steve came over to stay briefly with Scylla Lancelyn Green, Richard's sister, and that's near Oxford, which is where I live, and I and my wife and Steve and his wife, we were able to meet, and I think that made an awful lot of difference. I personally believe it did, just to know the face at the end, to see the brain behind the face, to understand the way that we work, and I truly believe that was important, and we were able to work together via email and telephone call, most of all, on this project of trying to get as many people as possible, some of whom had spoken, for example, at the memorial service for Richard in 2004, but their speeches had never been published before. And so that was easy from my point of view. For example, Peter Horrocks, a former chairman of the Sherlock Holmes Society, writes in this book about the Sherlock Holmes statue project, the statue that now stands outside Baker Street Underground Station. Philip Porter, another former chairman, writes about about Memories of Richard and Talking Books. This is when Richard and Douglas Wilmer and Philip worked together on these wonderful recordings, recorded, of course, by Douglas Wilmer, of the Sherlock Holmes stories. And we just sort of worked in parallel, pulling our people together as best we could.
We had a list, and we hoped to find as many people as we could that would help us. And almost everyone was willing to, but not everyone ended up being able to have the time to write by the time we decided we had to close the door on contributions. But we have a number of people largely from the Sherlockian world, but not entirely, because we tried to show other interests of Richard's, which there were. And we were able to reflect at least some of those interests with people who were able to write for us in the time frame that we had.
I was especially pleased that we were able to get the ambassador to Hungary, John Nichols, who spoke at Richard's memorial service. And it's nothing to do with Sherlock Holmes whatsoever. It's when John Nichols and Richard Lancelyn Green, as young men, toured Europe, and John has written a very, very nicely written, nicely paced, interesting piece which brings out so many pieces of Richard's personality as it was and character developing in the early 20s, well before he became the famous scholar that he did. I'm especially pleased with that one.
Nick, Steve, what if you had to reduce to a couple of sentences the impetus behind this book? What would it be? Was it Richard's character? Was it his scholarship? Was it the sadness of his passing, his tragic end? Was it some combination of these that provided the impetus for providing this recollection, this tribute?
Well, certainly the real impetus was his death, and I think the other was the fact, at least in my case, I can't really speak for Nick, but I believe so, that we felt we'd lost a friend, and we wanted to come up with something, that had to be the only real tribute for Richard as a book, as I keep saying, because the man ate, slept, and drank books.
Well, either that or we could have commissioned a plastic carrier bag in his honor.
You laugh. It's how we wanted to issue it.
I'll tell you, that would have been really sweet. That would have been a really nice remembrance for those of us who knew him.
I think that's very good. I think from my point of view, just to bring to be serious for 1 second, the worldwide publicity about the circumstances of Richard's death cast such a ghastly grey shadow on not necessarily the man, but what was surrounding the man and the situation, and it was all very bad, and I went to the inquest and things like that, which I think perhaps now one doesn't need to dwell on. And it seemed that one wanted, as Steve says, a book is the best way to do it, and to refresh those of us, the memories of those of us who knew him, and to try and introduce him to those whom may be interested enough to follow him, not necessarily in the depth of scholarship and the depth of research and the depth of collecting, but just to see an unusual personality, and we haven't touched on that, and this is maybe not the moment to do it, a possibly obsessive personality, but a one-off. Richard was a one-off. And we all liked and loved him in our various ways, and there aren't very many people of him of that sort around now. I think, Steve, you'd agree.
I would certainly agree. Richard was, as you say, a one-off, a unique person, and he lived his life according to his terms, largely, more than most people were able to, partly because he had an independent income, and partly because he would have whatever. And he was a man who felt quite strongly that he knew where he wanted to go and what he wanted to accomplish. And he didn't value his own contributions to scholarship as much as he probably should have. We included in this book a bibliography as far as we could go of all his writings, which runs for 30 pages.
Wow.
So you can see that he may not have thought much of himself as a scholar, but he produced an awful lot, a lot more than serious stuff than I know I have, and even than Nick has with 30 years of editing the journal. It's not all, although almost all, on Conan Doyle and Sherlock Holmes. And that's part of what you'll find when you read this, is you'll find a man who's also was interested in art and in architecture and in movies and in plays and
Owen Dudley Edwards, the great Doyle expert and indeed biographer of Conan Doyle, has produced a very interesting piece about Richard's attitude to raffles by E.W. Hornung. So we do try and go beyond Sherlock Holmes and Doyle. And I've written one piece about just going into his house a few days after his death to look at the collection. I've written another piece about one specific way in which he was able to help me in a scholarly way. Of course, it's still to do with Doyle and Holmes. But then on the other hand, you have John Michael Gibson, his collaborator, but he's not talking so much about Doyle and Sherlock. He's talking about the mania of collecting, which can, you might be a Shakespeare collector, you might be a collector of Matchbox toys or anything else, baseball cards, whatever. And I think John Michael Gibson has caught that mania very, very well indeed. It's so wide and varied.
Marina Stayek speaks about Richard and their shared love for Ferris wheels and traveling about the Ferris wheels of Europe and going on to Coney Island and riding the wheel there. And she even sends us a picture that we include of Richard standing in front of the Ferris wheel on Coney Island and Richard on the London Eye. So
that's wonderful. When I think back about Lancelyn Green, I had met him at various BSI dinners and also at those meetings of the Sherlock Holmes Society of London that I was lucky enough to attend, and I always found Richard to be very charming and very welcoming and a wonderful fellow to have conversation with. But I had absolutely no clue at all about his scholarship until the Oxford edition of the stories came out in 92 or 93, and I still remember the first experience of reading some of the commentary and annotations he provided. Of course, if my memory is right, Dudley Edwards was the general editor of the series, but Richard contributed a good deal, and I still recall the experience of reading some of Richard's commentaries, because it was Richard who seemed to me to be the great synthesizer. He put together his insight and his study and his scholarship about the doings of Conan Doyle, where Conan Doyle was, what he was reading, around the time he was writing the stories. And to me, Richard was the first one, at least in my experience, to assemble, the A to B, the C. This is what's going on. This is what's happening in Conan Doyle's life. This was in the popular press at the time. Ergo, here's what's happening in the Red-Headed League. Ergo,
I think he had the immeasurable luck or brilliance to be able to be both a good writer as well as a wonderful researcher. So, as you say, he was able to put A and B and C together from the evidence that he had, and it has to be said, the evidence that he often owned himself in terms of his collection, and be able to put it out to the wider audience in his annotations, in that editorship, in that series, and in his introductions to various other books, and in a very accessible and not too erudite, but by God scholarly way.
Well, as you say, definitely a unique individual, a one-off, who has made, certainly the lives of the four of us on the show here much richer for having known him, and has touched countless people around the world in numerous ways, between Sherlock Holmes or Conan Doyle, or, as you say, his art and architecture interest and scholarship, and hopefully will continue to affect people, both with his collection that is available for the public to view at as part of the Portsmouth City Library collection. And more importantly, because we're talking about it today, the book, Keeping the Memory Green, about, some recollections about his life, which, as I understand it, is available for sale both through the Sherlock Holmes Society of London website and the Baker Street Journal website. We'll have links to both of those in the show notes, so people can do a little bit more research about the book if they're interested, and certainly be able to make the purchase. Gentlemen, thank you both for being with us. It's been a great honor to have you both on the line, and I hope we'll have opportunity to speak with either or both of you again as the show progresses.
Thank you very much indeed, Scott, and I'm very glad that I was able to be on your side of the Atlantic, to be able to take part in this and keep your costs down.
Well, through the amazing technology we have these days, voice-over chats between countries are actually quite inexpensive. So,
thanks, Steve, and thanks, Scott.
So this week, in lieu of reading simply another editor's gas lamp, we thought we would give the man we've been talking about for this entire show some exposure. That is Richard Lancelyn Green. And Burt mentioned he had written, or rather had been the editor for some specific volumes of the Oxford Sherlock Holmes, which is a wonderful edition. We'll have a link in the show notes as to how to get an Oxford edition Sherlock Holmes. This is an edition that was put out in the early 90s, was heavily annotated, and in a far different way than the new annotated Sherlock Holmes by Leslie Klinger. This was annotated more in the lines of what was going on in the world at the time, what was going on in the life of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, and doesn't play the game about Sherlockian scholarship as much as the traditional annotated, but rather is a traditional annotated edition in the fact that it brings in all aspects of the author's life, of the time in which he was writing, and different influences which may have gone into the writing. And Richard was the editor for at least two of the volumes, I know. And Burt is going to read some excerpts from Richard's introduction to, I believe it's The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes?
Yes, it is. It's The Adventures, and this was really, although I had known Richard over the years, this was the first time that I was really blown away by what was his obvious scholarship. In the introduction that he wrote to The Adventures in the Oxford edition, he starts with a little introduction about when The Adventures was first published and what Doyle had already done. Doyle had already published one historical novel, Micah Clark, and had completed another, and had been, Richard writes, thinking about devoting the greater part of his time to writing. The idea had been discussed for over a year, but the decision became irrevocable after a visit to Berlin in November 1890, when he went in the hope of witnessing a demonstration of Dr. Robert Cook's consumption cure. He was unable to gain access to it, but a chance encounter with Dr. Malcolm Morris, a Harley Street dermatologist, decided his future. Doyle had worked on a part-time basis at the Portsmouth Eye Hospital, correcting refractions. So Morris suggested that he should set himself up in London as an eye specialist, which would give him security and allow time for literary work. It could easily be done, he said, if he were to, quote, put in 6 months' work, end quote, in Vienna to bring himself up to date with the latest developments. Doyle acted upon the advice without delay. He returned to London on 19 November 1890, reached Southsea 3 days later, and by the end of the month had notified his family of his intention to leave Southsea. A farewell dinner was held in his honor on 12 December by the Portsmouth Library and Scientific Society, of which he had been an honorary secretary, and on 18 December he closed the doors of Bush Villas for the last time, with his wife Louisa. He then went to Birmingham to stay with friends, and on Christmas Eve joined his mother at Mazengill in northwest Yorkshire. On the last day of the year, he set off for Vienna, which he reached on 5 January 1891, and after a few days in a hotel, he and his wife found lodgings at the Pension Bonfort in Universitätsstrasse, and in time he made his way to the Krankenhaus. However, his knowledge of technical German proved inadequate, and most of the time was given over to the pleasures of Viennese society, skating and riding, with the first 3 weeks entirely devoted to a short novel, The Doings of Raffles Haw, which he had agreed to do for Answers, the penny paper owned by Alfred Harmsworth, 1865 to 1922, later Lord Northcliffe. He left Vienna for Semmering on 9 March, visited Venice and Milan, spent a few days in Paris, where he saw Professor Edmond Landau, author of the standard work, The Refraction and Accommodation of the Eye and Their Anomalies, published by C.M. Culver, Edinburgh, 1866, and was back in London on 24 March, 1891. The idea for the Sherlock Holmes short stories was then foremost in his mind, and the writing of the first series coincided with his stay in London, which makes the period of particular significance. His search for accommodation took him to the area around the British Museum, where he'd stayed on previous occasions, and he found suitable lodgings at 23 Montague Place, at the back of the museum, in the road which runs into Russell Square. It is possible, as the census was taken on 5 May, 1891, to name all those who shared the building with him. Mary Esther Gould, a spinster of 54, was the landlady, and she lived with her sister Jane, a teacher at an elementary school. The boarders were Jane Sutherland, age 64, Edwin J. Davies, an 18-year-old clerk, Frank and Percy Jefferson, licensed victualers who ran the Old King's Head in Bear Street, and Carl A. Falstead, the Swedish consul in Sydney, New South Wales, with his English wife, Cecilia. 2 domestic servants, Mary Smith and Lily Brereton, completed the household, apart, that is, from A. Conan Doyle, age 31, who described himself as an ophthalmic surgeon, and his wife, L. Conan Doyle, age 33, and their baby daughter, Mary, born 1889. Doyle and his wife were isolated from the other lodgers, as they had a self-contained suite of rooms, which included a sitting room and a spare bedroom, but they presumably used a common dining room when not taking their food in the neighboring restaurants. Well, it goes on, but, I mean, you can tell the magnitude of Lancelyn Green's contribution to Doylean scholarship, there in a few paragraphs. He has delivered forth a reconstruction of Doyle's travels, the people with whom he spoke, the correspondence they exchanged, the thinking and decisions that he made, connecting it back to the Sherlockian world that I recall when I first read this to be absolutely remarkable. I mean, here is a reconstruction of events down to data from the census that identified the people in the same lodging house.
Yeah.
So you have got everything except the receipts from what he ate. And probably Lancelyn Green, had that somewhere in a folder. It's just remarkable scholarship. Unbelievable.
Well, and, in addition to the scholarship, as Nick rightly pointed out, he also had the ability to write well. And I'm looking at Richard's introduction to The Return of Sherlock Holmes in the Oxford edition. And a couple of shows ago, we actually talked about our favorite stories, and I mentioned how many of mine came from The Return of Sherlock Holmes. And, he mentions that Conan Doyle actually chose 4 of the top 12 stories from The Return. Those included The Dancing Men, which was placed 3rd on account of the originality of the plot. The Empty House placed 6th because it explained away the alleged death of Sherlock Holmes and introduced, quote, such a villain as Colonel Sebastian Moran, unquote. The Second Stain came 8th because it dealt successfully with diplomacy and intrigue. And The Priory School was placed 10th, if only for the dramatic moment when Holmes points his finger at the Duke. One would not wish to part with any of these stories. The mark of their greatness is that all criticism pales before them. Holmes lives in the pages. He lives beyond them, and in the London of his day, the apartments in Baker Street, the suburbs, and the outlying countryside. The cast of villains and clients shine as brightly as stage jewels. The artifice is in the art.
Oh, that's beautiful. That's absolutely
in addition
beautiful.
to a great researcher and a great collector, a very, very competent writer.
Yeah, more than a competent writer. It's sad. And I think it's a wonderful thing that Stephen and Nick have put this book forward, because there is, as we discussed, an element of setting the record straight about Lancelyn Green. And he was, particularly with the sad events of his passing, it's easy to, particularly for those who didn't know him or have any appreciation of his work, to dismiss him in some way as obsessive. And perhaps, to some degree he was. But I prefer to think of him as enthusiastic and focused and, as you point out, a fabulous writer and someone who brought true insight, who made a remarkable contribution to understanding the life and times of Sherlock Holmes. And it's difficult to find anyone else of his particular equal in delivering, I think what can only be described as new insight, a new perspective, a very special appreciation for the life and times of Holmes, as well as what went into the creation of the events.
Absolutely. And quite frankly, I think for anyone who is a collector of anything, there is some sort of peculiarity and obsessiveness and passion that goes around it. Because let's face it, if you have the resources and the energy and the time to devote to collecting, odds are you're fairly passionate about whatever your subject matter is, whether it's coins, stamps, theater tickets, you name it. It takes a certain passion to make this happen. And to outsiders who don't necessarily share the same interest, it may seem a bit peculiar, a bit odd. But for Richard, he was the perfect man in the perfect situation for what his collecting obsession was all about. And I think the rest of us have benefited from his obsessiveness and his willingness to share his collection with us.
Yeah, well said. Do you think of yourself as a collector?
That's a good question. I used to, when I was single and had more disposable income, I suppose. And in many ways, I think I may have thought of myself as an accumulator. I think I have the collecting bug in me. And part of what I've realized with my own Sherlockian collection is that it could become very, very big very quickly with no particular focus. And I think the best collections have, some sort of degree of focus around them, a story, as it were, a way to kind of fine-tune an interest. And I think I'm just at the point now where I'm trying to figure out what that specific direction is. But do you think of yourself as a collector?
No, I never have. But, I've just been redoing my study, and so I've now been unpacking books, and in some cases unpacking books that I haven't seen in a decade, and putting them back on the shelves and finding out that over the years I've bought the same book 2 or 3 times. And I'm reminded of an early conversation with my wife when I was explaining to her that I had, a number of fountain pens. Mm-hmm. And she said, "Oh, well, you must be quite a collector." And I said, No. I use these things. I just appreciate them." And she looked at me and she said, "You have 50 fountain pens. You're a collector." And now that I'm looking at all of the mystery fiction that I have, certainly several hundred books, which which is a pittance compared to the extensive collections of many of the people that we know. I guess it's indisputable that I must be a collector, but I never thought of myself as a collector. I just thought of myself as someone who enjoyed all of this stuff and bought it whenever I found it. I've never, with a couple of exceptions over the years, I'm not the sort of person that haunts old bookshops, happen on a hunt to find this particular volume or that particular volume to round out a collection. And so for that reason, I guess I never thought of myself as a collector.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, the old bookshops are fewer and far between these days. That I remember in Boston when I was in college and in graduate school, there were, at least 5 or 6 really good used bookstores I could go to. And now I think we're down to maybe 1 or 2. Yeah. That are reliable. And, maybe it's a sign of the times in terms of the economy, in terms of people's interest, or certainly in terms of what the availability of purchasing books online through Borders and Barnes & Noble and Amazon have done.
Yeah. Well, you don't need the shop and the rent and the staff and the lighting and the bills to run an old bookshop anymore. But I remember when I was younger, in the late 1970s and in the 80s, in New York, many of the old bookshops, the ones, that had been frequented by Chris Morley, were still there. Not only the Argosy and the Gotham, but others. And, it was a big part of my life, sort of to wander in and wander out. But those are also the days when you could pick up this volume or that volume for $1 or $2. So it really is a bygone era.
Well, and just looking around my office right now, I believe I've started a new collection. I guess I collect dust. It's all over everything here. There's a great scene in the opening of The Private Life of Sherlock Holmes, the Billy Wilder film starring Robert Stevens, where he comes in after being away and screams at Mrs. Hudson for having dusted while he was away. And she said, "Well, I'm trying to keep your rooms up, sir." And he said, "But Mrs. Hudson, that is my way of dating my work." And she said, "But there was an inch of dust on some things." And he puts his hand to his chin and says, "March 1883.
Yeah, it's a great scene.
I'm beginning to appreciate that a little bit.
Yeah, that's a great scene.
Well, this was another great show.
I think so. It was
wonderful conversations.
And it certainly was a groundbreaking show. I mean, the notion that after all these years, the American and British societies would be collaborating in a project like this is really very welcome.
2 societies separated by a common language.
And to think that Nick was editor for more than 30 years.
That's amazing. Amazing in this day and age. Oh. Well, if you have received any kind of inspiration out of this show or feel any need to tell us what you're thinking, we welcome it. So please give us a call at 774-221-7323. That's 774-221-READ. Send us an email at comment@ihearofsherlock.com, and you can certainly create an audio file of your own and email it to us at that address, or simply comment on the website, ihearofsherlock.com. Burt, thank you for being my better half once again.
Well, thank you. It was a great conversation. I'll see you next time.
You got it. And until then, the game's afoot.
I'm afraid that in the pleasure of this conversation, I'm neglecting business of importance, which awaits me elsewhere.
Thank you for listening. Please be sure to join us again for the next episode of I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, the first podcast dedicated to Sherlock Holmes.
Goodbye, and good luck, and believe me to be, my dear fellow, very sincerely yours, Sherlock Holmes.